Beyond the historical reasons which we saw as Bretton Woods, then the Nixon dollar decoupling from the gold, and thereafter economies settling on some sort of a mixed system. Beyond these historical reasons, there is an economic logic of choosing between the fixed and the flexible exchange rate regimes. And it actually just depends upon the kind of shocks that hit your economy. Let's just recap the shocks. We have done that shocks and frictions back in module 1, but let's just recap for a second. Economic shocks come in two flavors, and this is simple to sort of now understand because we have been talking about two things constantly. We've been talking about these pieces of paper, the money, and then we have been talking about these physical real things. So shocks also are similarly divided. There could be shocks that affect these pieces of paper, which is affecting money and prices, and some shocks affect these physical things, affecting the actual production or the actual consumption of these real things. This type of shocks are called as nominal shocks, which affect money. The other type of shocks are called as, very simply, real shocks. Now, if you think about these two kind of shocks, so imagine India as a country and there are these shocks that are hitting India from outside. If a shock is just hitting a piece of paper, right, if the character of that shock is such that it only is a nominal shock, then would you want things to change on the ground? You necessarily would not want to change things on the ground because this is just a shock on the paper wrapper. You don't want the real allocations on the ground to change. That is when you want the exchange rate to be fixed. But if there is a real shock that hits, for example, suddenly you discover a new oil field, okay, it's a shock. In economics, we have seen this before, shock could be positive or negative. So if you discover a new oil field, it's a positive shock. In this case, now because you have a much greater resource that you have discovered, you would want the real terms of trade to also adjust. So you would want newer allocations now. That calls for a flexible exchange rate. In this case, you would not want the exchange rate to be fixed because you want newer allocations now. So you would want flexible exchange rates in such a scenario. So fixed exchange rates provide insulation against nominal shocks, but flexible exchange rates are much preferred when the shocks are real. That is the whole economic reasoning of why you would prefer flexible exchange rates or fixed exchange rates. Now, any country does not live a life where it only faces one kind of a shock. It faces both kinds of shocks. There could be nominal shocks, there could also be real shocks. If you are facing both kinds of shocks, then you need some flexibility. So you don't have to really choose at the extreme corners of the spectrum, you would rather want to choose to have mix of both the worlds. That is precisely the reason why we see most countries have adopted a mixed managed floating regime, where they let market forces determine to a large extent, but also allow enough flexibility to intervene in the markets when needed. Now that we understand how exchange rates connect to the overall economy, let's now dive into the accounting that tracks all of these international transactions, the balance of payments.